You spend far too much time with your computer. It's not healthy.
Don't point your fucking finger at me.
I did it. It completely consumed my life for 2 weeks, but in quarantine, I watched the entire Game of Thrones series for the first time. And oh my god, those last 2 seasons were like... Obviously, I'm a little late to the party on this one. I went in completely primed and expecting to hate the last season, but I was actually surprised. Season 8 definitely was not the strongest season of the series, but it wasn't the worst season ever. I think Season 7 was worse, and at risk of alienating myself from the general public, I thought the ending made complete sense. All the characters completed the arc that they had set out on, with a few notable exceptions. And I know that's a controversial opinion, and really it's something that I would have to defend in a whole other video.
I demand a trial by combat.
But my point is, the last episode of Game of Thrones is not the worst episode. Neither is the episode before that. The worst episode is Season 7, Episode 6, Beyond the Wall. Nothing that happens in this episode makes any sense. It's completely concerned with the whole Army of the Dead plot line, and it's a really good example of the writers just not giving a shit about that plot line because it's really problematic. And I totally get where they're coming from, but we'll get to that. So in case you forgot everything that happened in Season 7, which would be completely understandable, Jon found out that there's dragon glass at Dragonstone, and right now Daenerys is hanging out at Dragonstone, plotting to take over the world, so he goes there to ask if he can mine the dragon glass to make weapons. This is important, keep it in mind. He also knows that the Army of the Dead is really big and he's going to need help from Daenerys and the Lannisters if humankind is going to survive. But Cersei and Daenerys are understandably reluctant to believe that an army of zombies is going to kill everyone. So Jon and his friends decide to go capture one of the zombies to prove that they exist and hopefully convince Cersei to fight with them. Okay, recap over. So the episode starts out with them already north of the wall, and it's a really weird ensemble of characters. We've got Jon Snow, of course, but Jorah is also with him, and the Hound of all people. He was traveling with the Lord of Light guys, and they're here too. And one of the first things that happens in this episode is Jon has a conversation with Beric Dondarrion about the fact that they've both been brought back to life by the Lord of Light, and how neither of them really understand it. Jon's just like, what the fuck, what does this all mean? And Beric's like, I have no clue. And then he says,
You and I won't find much joy while we're here. But we can keep others alive. We can defend those who can't defend themselves. Maybe we don't need to understand any more than that. Maybe that's enough.
Aye. Maybe that's enough. That's not good enough!
and it's not a terrible moment, except it's one of the last things that we hear about the Lord of Light in the entire series, so it kind of feels like the writers just going, we have no clue what to do with this, so here you go? Like they're saying we as the audience are not supposed to understand. But there's just been so much buildup and so much mystery surrounding the Lord of Light, and the Lord of Light has chosen such interesting random characters to keep alive and assist that it really felt like the Lord of Light was going to be, I guess, just explained a little bit more in the climax of the series. So this really kind of felt like a slap in the face. But anyways, they keep going and they run into a zombie bear.
Chubby little cubby all stuffed with fluffies. Willy-nilly silly old bear.
The bear kills, I think, 1 or 2 throwaway characters, and he almost kills the Lord of Light priest who keeps bringing back Beric from the dead. Very dramatically, might I add. But then Jorah just kills him in one hit with a dagger that I don't remember if it's made of dragon glass or Valyrian steel, but it kind of makes you wonder why someone didn't do this sooner. It kind of makes you wonder why everyone isn't carrying dragon glass weapons when they literally embarked on an expedition from Dragonstone, where there's a giant dragon glass mine, to find zombies that can be killed in one hit by dragon glass.
Well, this is it.
all we'll ever need.
I understand that they didn't have time to forge weapons, but you can literally hit obsidian with a rock and make a really sharp blade, or an arrowhead. Keep this in mind. But yeah, Beric heals his buddy with his very hot, flamey fire sword. Another thing that you should keep in mind. So they move on, and they finally find a small group of zombies led by a White Walker. So they go in and start fighting, and as soon as John kills one of the White Walkers, all the zombies except one dies, very conveniently. And they realize that killing a White Walker also kills every undead that he raised. So now they know that killing the Night King will bring down the entire undead army. So they capture that last zombie, but he lets out this scream, and they realize that the scream indicates their location to the rest of the army. It seems very odd that a small group of zombies wouldn't just do this at the very first sign of danger. So now, knowing that the entire undead army is about to descend upon them, they turn to Gendry and they're like, "Run back to the keep and send a raven to Daenerys. You're the fastest," even though that has been established in no way at all. But to his credit, he does finally make it to the wall. Throughout this episode, by the way, there is kind of other stuff going on in the Seven Kingdoms, but it's just a bunch of people standing around talking about stuff and kind of living their lives, so I'm not talking about it until the end. Anyway, the gang's getting chased by the entire army of the dead, and they end up fleeing to an island in the middle of an icy lake. And the ice is too thin to support the entire army, so it kind of just becomes a siege. They're stuck there all night with the dead just watching them, and it's really frickin' cold, and the next morning they wake up and they realize Thoros, the priest guy who almost got killed by the bear, froze to death in the middle of the night. And the wildling guy is like,
"We'll all be closed behind him, unless the Lord of Light is kind enough to send us a bit of fire."
And then Beric does this and uses his hot fiery sword to cremate the body of his friend who fucking froze to death. What the fuck? They just use these swords whenever they want throughout the entire series, and then on the one night when it's so cold that one of them freezes to death, they don't pull them out. Thoros had one of these.
Funny old life.
The bear attack scene was way more dramatic. If they were gonna kill him off in this episode anyway, why didn't he die in that scene? They could have used this runtime to play up the severity of the situation, instead of having him die off screen as a result of his and his friend's complete stupidity. Anyway, Beric seems pretty unfazed about the death of his longtime friend, and he suggests,
Killed him. He turned them all.
which, like, yeah, that makes sense. It's too bad there's no possible way you could have brought a ranged weapon guaranteed to take down White Walkers with a single hit, and Jon's just like,
You don't understand.
what does he not understand? That's literally how they defeat the Army of the Dead in Season 8. So anyway, the Hound gets bored, and he starts throwing rocks. One of the rocks lands on the ice, and it makes the dead realize now they can walk on the ice. The entire army can now walk on the ice. So let me get this straight. When they encountered this lake, which had been presumably sitting out in the middle of nowhere just being indefinitely frozen, it was less frozen than it is now after refreezing over the course of one night. That doesn't make any fucking sense. Well, maybe before it had just been weakened because of that break. Oh, nope. I mean, maybe they were there more than a night. There's theories about that, but the show didn't make it look that way. And it still just seems odd that after any amount of time, the lake would be more frozen than it was before. Anyway, they all start fighting, and it looks really bad. They're thinking, this is the end. But then at the last possible moment, Daenerys shows up with her dragons and starts fucking up the army. The dragons are going absolutely ham, burning all these zombies, and Daenerys lands Drogon to pick up Jon Snow and his friends. Now the Night King, he's got these javelins he can throw that can take down a dragon, and he makes the bafflingly obtuse decision, knowing that he could miss, to take down the much more difficult target of a flying dragon, rather than going after the dragon that is currently on the ground loading all of his enemies. Imagine if he did what anyone would do in his situation and just aimed for the dragon that was on the ground. Daenerys and Jon Snow and everyone else probably would have been burned alive, and even if they weren't, he could just sit there waiting for the other dragon to land and then kill that one too. But after that happens, Daenerys is like, fuck this, and she leaves without Jon. He falls into the freezing water, presumably to die, but he inexplicably doesn't. He starts trying to get away, but there's just absolutely no chance. But then, out of nowhere, Benjen Stark shows up and rescues him. He puts Jon on his horse, and Jon is like, hey, you should also get on this horse. And he's just like,
No time.
so he shows up at Castle Black alive, despite the fact that he fell in freezing water and his clothes were shown to have been frozen solid. And Daenerys sees those abs and a beautiful relationship is born. This is one of the things that really frustrated me. I mean, this episode isn't exactly where their quote-unquote relationship begins, but I definitely feel like you're supposed to think something is there after the end of this episode, and there's just no believable chemistry. Everything that's happened up to this point has just been their friends talking about how, hey, I saw you checking out such and such, and if there hadn't been so much inconsequential bullshit going on, this episode could have been used to develop that chemistry. Meanwhile, back at Winterfell, Littlefinger has been trying to turn Arya and Sansa against each other, and it seems to be 100% working. Remember that up to this point in the series, Arya has kind of been developed as more and more of like, basically a psychotic serial killer or a Punisher type character at the very best. Basically, her only motivating factor at this point is getting back at people who have hurt her family, and she now has what I think in her mind would be good reason to believe that Sansa has hurt their family, or at least tried to. So Sansa is suspicious and she's going through Arya's stuff and she finds the disembodied faces that Arya takes with her everywhere. And Arya walks in on her and continues to act like a creepy serial killer.
Good evening, Clarice.
I have hundreds of men here at Winterfell, all loyal to me.
They're not here now.
What are these?
And this is the last conversation that we see Arya and Sansa have before the scene in the next episode where Sansa puts Littlefinger on trial under the pretense of putting Arya on trial. And apparently Arya and Sansa at that point have come to some kind of agreement, and we as viewers can now know that Arya is definitely one of the good guys. And I don't have a problem with Arya ultimately siding with the Starks. Obviously, she's always been on the Starks side and pretty much nobody else's. What I have a problem with is the fact that the issue Arya has with Sansa is a totally believable and real issue that that character would have, and we never see that resolution. But I feel like with the amount of runtime that was in this episode and the episode surrounding it, we definitely could have. So the episode ends with the Night King getting all his cronies to pull the dead dragon out from under the ice so he can bring it back to life as a zombie dragon. And there's a line of zombies pulling a chain up a hill. You can't pull a chain around a curve. These guys aren't even doing anything. Look, I know that I've been nitpicking a lot. It's something I'm really good at. But the truth is, if you looked close enough at any episode of the series, or any good piece of media, you'd probably find just as many logical inconsistencies and plot holes. But those things never stand out as much when they're in the context of a well-constructed, compelling story with interesting characters doing interesting things. The plotline that involves the Army of the Dead and the Night King doesn't fit in very well with what Game of Thrones has always been trying to do. The series always featured a broad cast of characters with wildly varying goals and wildly varying lengths they're willing to go to achieve those goals. Almost all the characters are really morally ambiguous, but since all the way back in Season 1, it's been building toward a conflict with a villain who is completely morally unambiguous. The Night King is so stereotypically undeniably evil, and having all of these characters with their own agendas having to unite to take down the forces of evil is just never going to be satisfying in the context of something as complex as Game of Thrones. There's absolutely stories and mediums where that sort of plot can work, but Game of Thrones was never about the forces of good taking down the forces of evil. So I think the writers decided to put their time and energy toward the episodes that concerned the conflicts and resolutions that had more to do with the character conflicts, because really that was much more important to the overall story. Where I do fault them are the choices they made that really rubbed in how dumbed down this whole plotline really is. Having a dragon be killed by the Night King and then resurrected as a dragon that serves the Night King just emphasizes how cut and dry the good and evil conflict is. This part of the series is so black and white, and the whole rest of it is just in the grays, and that's what I really liked about it. Some of my favorite moments from watching the show were when I was rooting for someone who I didn't really want to be rooting for. You know what I mean? Like, Cersei Lannister is such an unsympathetic character who I want to hate so much, but it still feels so cool when she pulls off her evil schemes. And that's because the schemes aren't strictly evil. Nothing about the Night King's motives or character or actions makes me interested in him in any way, so although I can see the threat that he poses to the other characters, I'm not really interested in that conflict. And because it's happening alongside conflicts that are interesting and do have moral ambiguity to them, the entire plot basically has to go on hold so that this thing can be resolved. I guess what I'm saying is, whether you liked the finale or you hated it, the last 2 seasons just would have been a lot better if so much of their runtime hadn't been taken up dealing with a boring arc that didn't really advance anyone's character that much. So that's why this is the worst episode of Game of Thrones. The Night King and his zombie army are the worst thing to happen to Game of Thrones, and this is the best example of how destructive they were to everything that was good about the show.